Hey there, how's it going? I just wanted to cover some Vuhdo related stuff since I just put out some materials for people to borrow if they want to use my Vuhdo profile. And I thought that would be a good chance to kind of just go through kind of like the common uses for Vuhdo and like what I've used over the years that I've been playing and doing Mythic Raid. And, that might be a good starting point for you guys who are maybe looking for something a little bit different in terms of raid frames. So to start, the thing I really like about Vuhdo is it actually adds buttons that you don't normally have. And the way that it does that is through the spell editor. And so in the spells tab, you can basically, the default option is to assign mouse buttons to cast certain abilities when you're hovering over the raid frames. The keynote here is that if you're not hovering over the raid frames, it'll just use your default keybinds. So I can default keybind, 5 mouse buttons and at the same time have 5 different healing options when I'm targeting a player or a target or a special group or anything like that, because Vuhdo allows those options as well, a focus or whatnot. But then you can also use modifiers for those. So you can use shift clicks, you can use control clicks, alt clicks to gain some extra buttons without using like an MMO mouse or something like that, which I don't really like using MMO mouse. So this is a really good tool for me in order to free up some space on my binds. Basically, the way this is going to work is the simple way for your mouse is just to enter in this mouse section whatever you want your mouse buttons to be. But there are other ways to bind. You can bind your keys on your keyboard. And the way that you're going to do that is with this keys local. And so this is going to choose a local keyboard assignment. So the way you can do this is if I want to add in a new spell, right? Let's say I want to cast Spirit Bloom. And I want to cast Spirit Bloom with my T key. Now that's just bound T to Spirit Bloom, but only when you have it hovered over Vuhdo. If you use T normally and you're not hovering over Vuhdo, it'll just cast whatever's on your T keybind. And then you can easily remove those if you don't want to use them, or you can edit those macros to do other things when you click the button, like press a trinket or target a player or something like that. On top of that, we have a couple other options here that I don't use as often, but in the miscellaneous miscellaneous options here, you can trigger some things automatically. So let's say that we're outside of combat and people need to be rezzed. This smart cast section here has resurrect smart cast. So you just click on a dead member and it'll automatically cast your mass res, and same for battle res. If you're in combat and someone's dead and you click on them, it'll automatically cast your battle res. You don't even have to keybind it. You can do smart cast buffs and cleanses, but smart cast cleanse will just cleanse whenever you heal somebody. I mean, you could modify it with maybe like if you shift click on someone, it always cleanses or something like that. I personally don't really like this option. I prefer to just bind my cleanse. Yeah, so spells option is super useful for all those friendly things. And then of course you also have hostile units. So if I'm targeting a hostile and they're my target here, I could bind a bunch of hostile abilities and I could just click all my hostile abilities on the enemy frame. That works too for like boss frames. Like if you have like a lot of mobs spawning on a boss and you have like 5 or 6 mobs in the boss frames, you can hover over each frame and use your mouse modifiers. You don't even have to change targets. You can just use your mouse modifiers to target those boss enemies, which is actually kind of useful for like, dot specs. Even if you're not a healer, you can use Vuhdo pretty effectively, which I do for augmentation. I can get into that in a little bit. Okay. The next tab is your buff tab. This one's pretty simple. It's just going to create a little box. If you have your buff enabled, it creates a little box, your buff helper up here. And you can just click on this to automatically buff everyone who's in your party. But on top of that, you can set it up so that if people do not have buffs, it'll indicate it with a changed color on the frames outside of combat. So you'll notice like if you ever watch my stream or whatever, any of my stuff, you'll see that my raid frames will change to a bright white color when everyone is missing their Blessing of the Bronze, which reminds me to buff up before combat. Other than that, there's not a ton here for buffs. For debuffs, this is one of the other big things that I like to use. And that's because with Vuhdo, I can modify a lot about how debuffs look and when they appear, and even what sounds they make when they're cast, which you just can't do with the base UI. So first of all, is this ignoring, like in the standard pane, you have like this ignore irrelevant. Basically what this is doing is it'll automatically hide any debuffs that you don't like interact with. So let's say that someone has sated debuff, right? From pressing Bloodlust. Well, that's a non-harmful in a duration, or sorry, that's a non-harmful debuff. So that one won't show up because I have this ticked, right? And so I've filtered out a few other things, like duration debuffs are like things that last for like a second or two. Those are all filtered out because it's not like I could do much about them anyway. And then like specific debuffs that some classes put on themselves, you don't need to see because it's not relevant to you. So you can ignore those. And same with like, if someone has like entangling roots or something like that and you want to see that, you could tick movement off. I usually keep it on because I'm not too worried about that. Because if it is a magic debuff, it'll still show up as removable. And then here's another thing you can play with is removable only. So debuffs will hide themselves. If you tick this on, debuffs will hide themselves unless there's something that you're able to remove through Cauterizing Flame, through Expunge, etc. Or any other dispel. But if you tick it off, you'll just see all debuffs, and then you could filter out ones that you don't want through a blacklist. Okay, cool. The reason that I leave these all on is because I actually whitelist debuffs. So I try to remove as many as possible, and then I whitelist the ones I want to see, because I like to keep it as minimal as possible. Okay. In the custom options, this is where you can actually put in new debuffs. This is the whitelist, which is what I use. So if I'm ever, here's a good example. If you're looking at a dungeon through Mythic Dungeon tools, a lot of the time, well, they'll basically have the spell information for each mob in this dungeon, right? So if you right click on a mob, it'll show you its spell information. And let's find an easy debuff here. Let's go to like Brackenhide. So in Brackenhide, there's a ton of things that put diseases and bleeds on you. And an example of that is these lashers. So when I hover over a mob in a dungeon journal, or sorry, Mythic Dungeon tools, and right click, it'll show me, what they cast. And this bleed is pretty important. And so I have that listed in my whitelist. It's this option right here. It's just bleeding. You just type in the name of whatever it says in the Mythic Dungeon tools, and now that debuff, as soon as you hit save, is going to show all the time on your frames whenever it's put on a player. And you can modify how that debuff is shown. If you want to see the debuff for the entire time that it's up, you click full duration. But if it's a debuff that lasts like 3 minutes, maybe you don't want to do that. But most debuffs you're going to want the full duration. You can have an animation when it comes on. It'll be like a zoom animation. You can show the icon or choose not to show the icon. Instead of the icon, I believe you can do like a bar glow or bar color, if that is something that is easier for you to see. And then you can get like a timer, or if you don't want the timer and you just want the icon's radial duration tracker, then you can do that. And you can even show stacks of them, what the source is, all those things. So you can play around with that. The other really nice thing is that you can choose a sound. So when this debuff is applied to a player, it'll play a bite sound, which lets you know that that debuff has been cast somewhere, so you can look for it on your frames. But I have all sorts of debuffs like that, and I really encourage, like, if you're really active in Mythic Plus, especially, I would like really hand pick your debuffs so that you are able to react really quickly when those things happen. Cool. The other thing is going to be how those debuffs look on your frames. You can modify that as well. So you can modify the position. So right here is going to choose the anchor for your debuffs. So basically where the first debuff is going to go, and then it'll fly out from that direction. So if I choose this one, the debuffs are going to start at the top left and they're going to fly out to the right, or they'll start at the right and fly out to the left, right, etc. You can choose how big those icons are going to be. You can even modify slightly down or slightly up from these anchor points, and you can select a max number of debuffs. So if you want to like reduce the clutter, I would drop, mine are always kept at 2 debuffs maximum. I don't want to see any more than that in any situation, because then it would just completely cover up my frames. So I just keep it lower. And then some debuffs, well, all debuffs have, well, most debuffs are going to have durations. And the durations will be tracked here with the timer. And this option window here is just modifying what that timer number looks like. And then, of course, stacks. So if you have stacks of a debuff, they'll appear in the top left of the icon, and this pane will modify how that text looks. Cool. So now we'll talk about the panels options. And this is kind of just the deciding what you want your panels to look like. There's a ton of different options in here, and it's key to understand that you only modify one panel at a time. So you'll notice I have panel 1 and I have panel 2. Well, I have to select panel 1 in order to change the options for it. Same for panel 2, okay? So right now let's stick with panel 1, which right now is my raid frames. And there's a few things to look at here. So right here up at the ordering section, you have a couple options. So grouped and loose. I prefer loose because I like to sort my players by their role. But you can choose grouped, and that'll just be like normal raid frames. It'll group everybody by their group actually in the raid panel, like how you normally see it. I prefer loose because of the sort by option. And Vuhdo can sort your frames for a lot of different things. So my favorite ones is to put healers last, because often healers don't need a lot of healing. They heal themselves quite a bit. And then tanks, I mean, they need a lot of healing, but they're not my priority. They're not always going to die. And then I put all the damage dealers at the top because they're usually the ones who are most at risk of dying. But you can flip that around however you wish. There's several options in here. And mine I've chosen this option and inverted it, just so you know. So this invert option will just reverse the order of this priority list. So you can play around with that a little bit. On top of that is these alignment options. So if I choose horizontal, my frames will fill from the left to the right, top to bottom. So left to right and then top to bottom. If you click this off, it'll go top to bottom, then left to right. So you can kind of fit that in with your UI using the horizontal option, however you want it to fill. And then you can hide empty frames. So if I chose to not hide empty, if I was in a group of 20, I would have random frames available that just don't have anybody in them. So I prefer to just always hide empty groups, empty players. And then I always put myself first because I use Vuhdo as my player frame as well, which has all the same functionality that you would normally have from a player frame. It's just being able to be modified by Vuhdo instead. Cool. Let's move on then to some other stuff in here. So I believe the other big thing in this panel, there's a ton of different customization options here in terms of just how these unit frames look, but I'm more worried about some other functions that you can get here. So one big one is going to be HOTS. So the hot icons page is not only helping you with heal over time effects, it'll actually help you with any buffs that you put on any player. So this is all buffs sourced by you, and you'll just go ahead and enter in the name. You have to capitalize the name of the spell, but go ahead and enter in the name of whatever hot or buff you want to see on other players, and it'll just create a list, and it'll do like a priority list. So there's a position for each of these buffs on the frame, and those are all modified by like the size of the buff, and you can modify their anchor position using this, which we saw earlier. And those will show up as little icons normally. You can change that into squares, so if you just want to see colors instead of icons to help you out there, you can do that. I think the flat texture is also kind of like, it's just like a symbol. but I prefer icons just so I know exactly what I'm putting on other players. And then there's some other options you can do here if you explore a little deeper. And then hot bars is the same thing as hot icons. It's just creating a bar instead of an icon with a duration, which I really don't prefer to use because I think it's really clunky. It has like a large effect on your frame, but feel free to play around with that too. And then your hot choices are right here. But like, to prove my points with the hot icons, a good idea for these is like if you're playing Augmentation. So even though I'm not a healer spec, it's actually really useful on an Aug spec because I can put those buffs as icons. So as you can see, when I swap specs, it swaps profiles, which is super nice. My Prescience, my Ebonite, and my Blistering Scales are all tracked. So if I go ahead and cast all those on myself, you can see it tracks all those buffs there. But yeah, so using the hot icons is super useful. And then the last things I wanted to talk about with panels is how to select private tanks. So now that we're in Aug spec, you might have seen this before if you ever watched like Sanghelios, who's like a liquid augmentation evoker. But with the way that he has his UI set up is that he's choosing targets to put in his buff order. And he only buffs like 5 targets, and then the rest of his raid frames are out, you know, on the side of the screen where he doesn't need them. And the way to do that is using a macro. Well, there's a couple steps here. So first thing is that you're gonna need a panel that has the special option for private tanks, okay? So you're gonna need a private tanks group. And then once you have that private tanks group, you will be able to use a macro in order to select who your private tanks are. Ignore the fact that it says tanks. It's just basically a choice of the people that you want to see in the frame. Let me see if I still have the macro saved. I don't. That's okay. It's pretty easy. So let's say I want to select 5 or 4 people to buff. So let's just say this is private tanks. And the option for that is VD, which is Vuhdo. That's a shortcut for Vuhdo. And then just PT, which means private tanks. And you'll be able to set people as private tanks when you target them. So let's say I target myself and I select myself as a private tank. So I'll just click this macro and you'll see it flew out over here. This panel should be my private tanks panel. Yep. So you'll see that I now have a separate frame for my private tank, right? So here's my normal player frame, but I've selected a private tank so that that person goes there. And then you can turn that off just by targeting the player and then clicking the macro again, and it'll remove them from the private tanks. And then you can modify private tanks as you would any other panel. You can put it in a different place than your normal frames, or you could do whatever you want with it. But you just basically select your players for each pull. I'd recommend 5 players at least for DPS players in terms of amount that you want to be buffing per pull. And that'll allow you to easily choose with Prescience who you want to buff. Yeah, that should be it for private tanks and our panels options. Yeah, looks good. So next panel here, or next panel options here, is colors. This also affects our panels, and it'll affect what color our panels turn during certain moments, like under certain effects. So right here in modes is where you can select the color of your panel if you're using my profile. Right now when people are healthy, I have them at a black color, and then that will turn into a red color as they go lower health. And you can choose basically what low health you want to look like. And same for like if they're 50%, right? So they look gray at 50%. So it's kind of like that gradual, that gradient, that's the word I'm looking for. But you can also select a solid color for your frames, and you can change that in the panels options. The other thing is the target unit. So when you target somebody, you can change what color that target looks like. So for me, normally it's just tracking their player color. So as you can see, their player color is, or their class color, excuse me, not player color. Their class color is going to be that text there. And then the rest of the frame, I just always leave it black. But you can modify that as you see fit, and that is also in the target unit options. So basically, you can select here if you want to use a class color as the background. If you just want to use the normal behavior of your frames, you use the friend or foe option, or you can use the solid option, and that solid option will pull from this life color here. Or you can use like a gradient color, which is going to be the same as these colors here. There are some other things here, like if you want to just use the friend or foe, it'll pull from these colors in the middle. But yeah, that also exists for you to customize. I think that's it for colors. So we'll move on to the tools. So I talked about earlier how when I swap specs, it'll actually swap profiles. So if I go back to Pres, it'll change my keybinds, it'll change what my frames look like if I want it to, all sorts of stuff. It also changed the buffs that are appearing. I have that all set up automatically, and if you download my profiles, you'll have that all set up. You don't have to mess with it. If you are interested in doing that for yourself, the options are over here. So it's kind of tricky to use. Every time you change an option here and swap specs, you need to close the Vuhdo window. So select your option, close the Vuhdo window, then change specs, then reopen the Vuhdo window. The Vuhdo window doesn't like to, the Vuhdo options don't like to update while the Vuhdo window's open. They kind of get clunky there. So that'll mess with you a little bit, but that's okay. Just be intentional about it. So I have this preservation spec set up for preservation. Along with that are the key layouts. So I have different keybinds for each spec, and so those are all saved right here. So you need to click on the preservation thing here. You're going to apply the keybinds, and you're going to save them with a name. And then I also want to load the hot options. So I have different hot icons for preservation and augmentation, right? So I want to load those per spec. So on the preservation profile, I have them loaded. And then if you swap to the aug profile, those are also loaded for aug specifically. Pretty simple there. And then when you want to change profiles manually, remember you have to hit apply and then you hit save. And then you just close the window. You don't have to hit save. Sometimes when you hit apply, you can like overwrite a profile on accident. So I prefer to just do that. But anyways, at least hit apply and hit OK. Cool. And then the other tip here for profiles is that you can activate them on group size. So if I have a raid and I'm playing augmentation, I want to see just my private tanks. I only want to see like 5 DPS at a time. And so I have it activate this raid profile based on when I have more than 5 players in the group. But if I have only 5 players in the group, I don't mind seeing all 5 of those players at all times in a dungeon. I don't need the private tanks, I'll just see my party, right? And so that is activated based on 1 to 5 players. Cool. Anything else for tools? It looks like nothing except how to import. So when you do import a profile, which is this option right here, you're only importing the visuals of the profile. You're not actually importing the keybinds, the key layouts, the buffs or debuffs. You're not importing any of that. You need to import those here in the key layout section. So for every Vuhdo profile, you're gonna have 2 imports, one for the key layouts and one for the profiles. Cool. Final tab here before we get into the general tab is the move tab. And I showed this off a little bit earlier, but basically what this allows you to do is go into each group here or each panel and select what you want to be seeing in those panels. There's tons and tons of options. For example, if I go to special, there's like a bunch of different options if I want to see just melee, just ranged players, all this stuff all the way down, right? Myself, my pet, you know, whatever, targets and focus. But what I primarily use is just the party frames, my target frame, and if you want the focus frame, and then the private tanks, because I think the private tanks is super useful as an augmentation player. But yeah, you don't need to overthink this too much. Just get what you need and play with it later if you want. But The other big thing here is that you can test what your panels look like. So let's say I want a raid size of 20, I'll hold test, and then I can swap to like the panels options, and I can modify the panels now looking at 20 players. That's pretty much it. It basically just helps you out a lot in terms of customization, this tab. Pretty simple. And then if you do need to add new panels, that's the option right here. If you need your panels to be bigger, you press these little plus signs here and you can add in new groups, and then you can remove them as needed. Cool. Last thing, and I saved the general tab for last because it has a lot going on. And I encourage you to kind of flip through a few of these options by yourself. You might be able to figure out how some of them work, but the only things that I'm going to worry about for right now are these filters in the general tab here. So there's a few things that will show. Let's say if I have the private tanks enabled, it'll normally show the focus and my target. But I don't want it to show my focus and target. I want it to show just the people that I have selected as private tanks, right? And so you need to filter those players out. There's a reason I have target unit not selected here, but it's irrelevant. But you'll want to filter those out, right? Because I don't want to see my focus as an AUG on top of all my private tanks. I just want to see my private tanks, so I can filter those out by hitting the check mark here. Same thing, like if you don't want to see your own group for whatever reason in a raid, you can click that check mark. If you don't want to see the private tanks at all, and you don't want them to show, well, how should I say this? If you don't want your private tanks to show in the raid frame, but you only want them to show in the private tanks frame, you can click this on, and they'll hide themselves. As you can see, those two frames got removed. They'll hide themselves from the raid frame when you select them as a private tank. So that can kind of save some space on your screen if you wish. And then there's a ton of other options here if you don't want to see yourself, if you have your own player frame, etc., etc. The other thing is going to be hiding panels. So there's panels that, let's say I'm in a group size of 20, and 5 of those players are in a different group than group 4. So let's say it's a group size of 20. Well, everyone should be in group 1, 2, 3, and 4, but the raid leaders put them in group 5 for some reason. Normally, as a Vuhdo user, that would be super annoying because it's like, oh, now I just have this big empty group in my raid frames. Well, you can remove that with the hide panels option. So if you want to hide empty panels, you just click that. If you want to hide empty buttons, which is going to be like when a focus is gone, or when raid members leave in combat, or like when you no longer have a target, or you don't have a private tank, right? If you have 5 private tank options, but you only have 3 of them, you'll be able to hide those extra panels there as well with the empty buttons. So I think checking both of those on just makes your frames look cleaner in general. And then like if you're in a situation like you're solo by yourself, you're in a party, or as in like not a raid, so you only want Vuhdo to enable in a raid, you can click that. And then if you're in a pet battle, you probably don't need to be seeing your Vuhdo, so you can hide it there. There's also like a lock app option that I think is really useful. So if you don't want your frames moving at all, you just enable the lock. If you only want them to lock while you're in combat, it's right there. And then the no clicks is going to make sure that you can click through the background of the Vuhdo panel. So the panel is like pretty large, but if there's people missing from the panel, I can click through that if I have that enabled. Cool. Other thing I want to talk about here, and there's a ton of stuff here, so feel free to look at it, are the indicators. The indicators annoy a lot of people. If you've noticed when you download Vuhdo that you see like, oh, this player's you have the DPS indicator, the tank indicator, and the healer icon. You know, you have those little things in their frame, and it's kind of annoying because it's irrelevant information for me. That's actually the special dot indicator option, and a lot of people really struggle to find that. But these indicators can be very useful. So basically what this is showing you is that this red part is going to be the visual that you get. And then the drop down is going to be the trigger for that visual. Okay. And so the trigger for a special dot is usually going to be player role or player role icon. There you go. So role icon is what's normally set to, and it annoys a lot of people. You get these icons and you don't want them. Pretty simple. You just go in there and you turn those off. But there are useful ways to use this, such as like the direction that players are from you. Let's see. You can monk stagger or something you could put in that little option. Trail of light, so you can see as a priest who your last targeted heal was. If someone can be swift mended, that option can be turned on. Okay, there's tons of options in here for you to play around with. Something else that's useful is like highlighting the frame that you're actually mousing over, right? But anyways, feel free to play around with this. You can disable mana bars here. You can get rid of the aggro indicator here, right? But yeah, that can be a lot, but there's stuff in here that you can play around with for sure. Cool. I think that is everything I wanted to cover. If you do want to download my personal profile, or profiles, sorry, I have 3 of them for Aug and Prez, you can go ahead in the description, or you can reach out to me on Discord or whatever. But yeah, thanks for watching.